Alright everyone, welcome back to another Commander Deck Tech video. Here to talk about the pretty cool commander option, Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. From Kaldheim, he is a 6 mana, 6/6 trample, haste, Phyrexian Praetor. If you would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. If an opponent would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. So in typical Praetor fashion, this is a very one-sided ability that will exclusively benefit you while exclusively punishing your opponents. Very powerful abilities, and it would be nice to see if we get the other Praetor sometime soon. Admittedly, I was kind of underwhelmed by this Vorinclex until I realized that this is like the first commander option where we get to double counters, and the more that you look at it that way, the potential is actually pretty great. Even though we're just in mono green, there's still a ton of counter support. And there's of course Planeswalkers and Infect, so that's kind of what this deck is going to be. We're going to have a little bit of everything. So to start it off here with the lands, we have 34 forests, we have Inkmoth Nexus. Since Infect is a thing, and that's what we're going to try to do, we're going to try to infect our opponents. We get twice the poison counters on our opponents, so it makes something like Inkmoth Nexus a lot more viable. Karn's Bastion is a pretty good land for any kind of counter strategy. Doesn't have to be +1/+1 counters, but again, poison counters, -1/-1 counters, loyalty counters. We have Oran Reef the Vastwood. We can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield this turn by tapping it. And then we have a Rogue's Passage, making it pretty easy to deal that infect and poison our opponents by making a creature unblockable. We have some easy mana production here. We're not going to go heavy into artifacts because this is mono green, and we have a lot of good mana production outside of artifacts. But we do have Sol Ring, we have Arcane Signet. We also have Gyre Sage to fool around with +1/+1 counters that adds a green to your mana pool for each one. Also has Evolve, so a pretty easy way of getting that up there. We have Incubation Druid, another easy way that we can get more mana. Taps for 3 mana once it has a +1/+1 counter. And then we have 3 of the 2 mana sorceries that search for forests, or any land I guess. Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, and 3 visits. And then we have Fertilid, because you can never have too many lands. And it's kind of like those sorceries, but every turn you can just keep paying that 2 mana. If you can put more counters on it, just keep doing this. It's never a bad thing. You can just keep getting those lands, which really helps if your commander is 6 mana and above. Then we have Rishkar Pima Renegade to pretty much make each creature we have a mana dork. All of our creatures with counters on them can tap for 1 green mana. And then we have Skyshroud Claim. If you can search for a forest and put it into play untapped, it's going to be a pretty good sorcery. We do have some protection here. It's pretty important that our commander stays out there, so we have Heroic Intervention, just to make all of our permanents hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. We have Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots to really protect our Vorinclex, and we have Asceticism to really just drive home the point that we want our Vorinclex and other stuff to stay out there. Also important if you're playing any kind of infect strategy that you have this kind of protection, because it usually makes you the archenemy at the table. So we do have 17 counter cards here, cards that really just focus on the +1/+1 counters. We have Hardened Scales because it's probably one of the best 1 mana cards you can play in this deck. If you get a +1/+1 counter placed on a creature, you get that many +1. You have the Ozolith. This is just a crazy card. 1 mana artifact, one of the most busted ones ever made. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. And then at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. So the counters it gets initially could be doubled off of your Vorinclex, and then the counters that it puts on another creature is going to be doubled again. So that's just ridiculous. You could put it on Vorinclex and deal commander damage pretty easily. And then we have Branching Evolution, pretty much just half of a doubling season, which is good enough in this deck. We don't really need the tokens. We're just going to put twice the +1/+1 counters on creatures we control. Champion of Lambholt gets more +1/+1 counters, and then creatures with power less than Champion of Lambholt can't block creatures you control, so that's a pretty cool win con. We have Evolution Sage. Whenever we play a land, we proliferate. We have Hydra's Growth, a nice aura, a very underrated aura as well. When it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on the enchanted creature, And at the beginning of our upkeep, we double the number of +1/+1 counters on enchanted creatures. So we double and then we double again with Vorinclex, getting us just a ton of +1/+1 counters. We have Mana Gorger Hydra, massive trampler early on in the game. One of the best things you can play turn 3. We have Pure Imaginative Rascal. For all intents and purposes, pretty much just another Hardened Scales, which isn't really a bad thing. We have Predator Ooze. Just a 3-mana indestructible creature going to serve a similar purpose to Mana Gorger Hydra. You know, it's a turn 3 play, it's just going to get bigger and bigger. Has indestructible instead of trample, but going to be a force to be reckoned with because whenever a creature dealt damage by Predator Ooze dies, it gets another +1/+1 counter, so it just becomes an even bigger problem. And then we have Tuskguard Captain. Each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample, which is nice. We have Forgotten Ancient, another way that you can ensure you're going to get an insane amount of +1/+1 counters is with a Forgotten Ancient, because once you decide you want to move all of them onto another creature, you're going to get twice. So there are a lot of quick ways that you can win the game with a Vorinclex. Forgotten Ancient is a pretty easy way of doing that. We have Renata, Called to the Hunt. Each other creature we control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. And then we of course have Doubling Season because it works for several permanent types, so you can do this with Planeswalkers as well. We have Death's Presence. Whenever a creature you control dies, you put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the power of the creature that died. So even if you don't have any kind of previous +1/+1 counter presence, a creature dying with a high power is going to still net you some +1/+1 counters. And in a similar fashion, we have Slurk All Ingesting. So it enters the battlefield with 5 counters, and whenever Slurk or another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that has a +1/+1 counter on it. We have Vigor. If damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage and then put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each one damage prevented this way. Vigor is fantastic. Of course, you have a big trampler here, but it's just going to get out of hand. It's going to make everything else crazy. And then we have Avenger of Zendikar, because we have a bunch of those 0/1 green plant creature tokens that can get +1/+1 counters off of that landfall trigger. We do have some card draw here. We have Inspiring Call just to take advantage of all of those creatures with +1/+1 counters. They also gain indestructible until end of turn, so this is a very good card. We have Armorcraft Judge, another good creature that draws us cards for each creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it. We have Harmonize because it's one of the better green sorceries, but it's a quick way that we can just draw 3 cards. And then we have Rishkar's Expertise. This one is very good. For 6 mana, we draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control, and then we may cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. So it's probably the best way that we can draw the most cards, and we'll also be able to cheat into play something CMC 5 or less. We have some retrieval cards in here, really just to benefit us later on in the game. We have Regrowth, so we can just return a card from our graveyard to our hand, Eternal Witness, and then we have Plane-Wide Celebration. This one's a little bit different. It's multi-purposed, of course. We have 4 different modes, but I really like the fact that we can proliferate and return permanent cards from our graveyard to our hand. I think those 2 are the most powerful modes. We have some removal in here. We have Beast Within, Crossing Grip, Bane of Progress because it's more +1/+1 counter focused. We have Contagion Engine because it can proliferate and then proliferate again, which means we're going to get twice those counters. Also cool to fool around with -1/-1 counters because our Vorinclex is going to double the number of those as well. We have Whiptongue Hydra, which is an underrated card. Similar to Bane of Progress, it just ends up with a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it. And we have a finisher in here. We have Finale of Devastation, so we can get a creature from our library or our graveyard with converted mana cost X or less. We put it onto the battlefield. If X is 10 or more, creatures we control get +X/+X and gain haste until end of turn. This is beneficial for us because we are playing Infect, and you'll see here in a moment, we need a way to quickly win with Infect. We have ways of doing that, but this is just a great way of doing it because it gives all of our creatures haste and insane power and toughness. So we have 8 Infect cards, so it's not a big part of the deck, but it's something we can take advantage of with cards like what I just talked about. Viridian Corruptor, 3 mana, good ETB, it can destroy an artifact. Has Infect, it's a 2/2, so it's a way that we can deal those poison counters. We have Grafted Exoskeleton, so we can throw this onto any creature. It gets +2/+2 in Infect. We have Triumph of the Hordes. This is another win con. Until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample and Infect. so this is probably the safest way that we can win, giving all of our creatures trample and infect, in addition to the power they probably have with +1/+1 counters. It should be a sure thing. We have Phyrexian Hydra, massive 7/7. If damage would be dealt to Phyrexian Hydra, prevent that damage. Put a -1/-1 counter on Phyrexian Hydra for each 1 damage prevented this way. Kind of a negative condition with our commander out there, because then those -1/-1 counters are pretty much doubled because it's an effect that we control. But still a massive infect creature that most of the time this is going to be a one-shot, so we shouldn't really be too concerned about any drawbacks. And that's similarly why we're playing Putrefax, Trample, Haste, and Infect. If we can double the counters, if they can't block it, they're pretty much dead. We do have to sacrifice it at the beginning of the end step, but still. There are a lot of cards that you play just so you can one-shot an opponent. We have Phyrexian Swarmlord, so if you want more creatures with Infect, you have a creature that can get you there, but it's another green creature with Infect. They don't necessarily have to be the best. We have Spinebiter, a 3/4. You may have Spinebiter assign its combat damage as though it weren't blocked, so that Infect, those poison counters, you can get them through pretty easily. We have Blightsteel Colossus. Not a big fan of playing it all the time, but if you can double the counters, it makes it a lot easier to kill off opponents. And then to finish off the deck, we do have 9 Planeswalkers. I think it's good if you can take advantage of several different counters. So we have loyalty counters here. We have Zhang Yengu. This was from War of the Spark. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has tap to add 1 mana of any color, and you can -1 him to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. I really like that static ability though. We have Vivien, Champion of the Wilds, another good static ability. You may cast creature spells as though they had flash, which is really good for infect creatures that you don't want to leave out there for too long. The other abilities are okay, they're nothing to write home about. It's really about that creature flash. We have Garruk Wildspeaker, one of the best Planeswalkers. His plus is pretty good, you get to untap 2 target lands. -1 just gets you a 3/3, but the alt, the -4, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. That's always been pretty good, and he's a reasonably costed Planeswalker. And then we have another really good Planeswalker. We have Freyalise, Llanowar's Fury. All of these abilities are good. The +2 just gets you mana dorks. -2 is good removal, and the -6, you draw a card for each green creature you control. Always relevant, a fantastic inclusion for this kind of deck that focuses on counters. And then we have Garruk Primal Hunter, another pretty legendary Planeswalker. Can get you a green beast creature token, the -3, you draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. That's a crazy good minus because you saw how Freyalise's ult was pretty good card draw. This is just a minus, and you'll end up with arguably even more card draw. The -6 is a pretty good ult because it gets you a ton of 6/6 green worm creature tokens for each land you control, so you'll end up with a ton of attackers. And then we have Nissa, who shakes the world, so effectively a mana doubler. I mean, this Planeswalker is ridiculous. The +1 can get you a bunch of +1/+1 counters on your lands, make them creatures, so you can attack with them. You get an emblem with lands you control of indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, so you can have a pretty powerful land army. We have Karn Liberated because if you're going to get to any alt, Karn's alt is pretty powerful. It's not practical, but it's powerful. So if you are able to get to it, chances are you're probably going to win the game. Even if you don't alt immediately, you have good exiling removal, and sometimes you need that kind of removal in green. We have Nissa, Genesis Mage. I think all of these abilities are pretty good, but the +2 and the -10 are really what I want her in here for. You can untap up to 2 target creatures and up to 2 target lands. That can net you a bunch of mana. And then the -10, you look at the top 10 cards of your library, you put any number of creature and or land cards from among them onto the battlefield, and then you put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So that could get you an insane amount of creatures. And then the last card we have in here is an Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. Again, if you can immediately just get to an alt, that's the cool thing about Planeswalkers is that they'll enter with twice the loyalty counters. So it's very similar to Doubling Season and why that's so powerful in Super Friends decks. It makes it so much easier to get to an alt, and Ugin's alt is pretty powerful. If it's not straight up a win con, it sets you up really nicely. So anyway guys, let me know what you think about this deck. Let me know what you think about Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. I think he's a pretty powerful commander option if this is what you want to focus on. It's like if you had one part of Doubling Season on a commander, and while it may not be the most creative commander option, it's definitely a powerful one. If you haven't already, subscribe, like, comment, and share. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Void here signing off. Have a wonderful day.